I am so excited to introduce to you guys our moderator for today's panel. Her name is Ashley Thompson. Ashley is the Managing Director of the Blackbaud Institute for Philanthropic Impact, which brings together innovators and various experts to develop and share cutting-edge research for the philanthropic sector. Through her role, Ashley builds thoughtful strategies and solutions for the philanthropic sector, utilizing the most comprehensive data set in the social good community. She also serves on the board of directors of Mission Capital, a nonprofit resource hub here in Austin, for those of you unfamiliar. And she is also the VP of Partnerships for the Austin chapter of the Association of Fundraising Professionals. Please join me in welcoming Ashley. And with that, we're also going to submit a quick poll to you guys. We just kind of want to test the waters, get a sense of what you guys are, how you're experiencing the your own fundraising during the pandemic, getting a sense of your size of your organization. So if you could just fill that out while we're quickly going through some introductions, and then we'll pull up those results as we're hopping into the panel. So with that, I'll hand it over to Ashley.
Great. Thank you, Francoise. Yes, I appreciate that introduction. And you know, as she shared, I always say that I have the best job at Blackbaud. Our team is really dedicated to research. We're completely product agnostic. And my job is to really try to put out research, to use our data, to mine it, to try to find answers to not only trends, what's happening on a large scale in terms of giving and philanthropy, but what are some of the practices that we can actually highlight that bubble up in that research that we can answer certain questions around, and certainly around best practices around fundraising. So I speak to a lot of groups and certainly talk a lot about trends. And so before I introduce the rest of our panel, I was going to give the quick snapshot of what we're seeing today. And I can talk a whole hour about this, but I will spare you and give you the quick highlights in 5 minutes here. But we just released our Blackbaud Institute Charitable Giving Report. It's an annual report that looks at about $40 billion in giving. We look at overall and online, how are things faring? We look at it by subsector. And if you haven't seen it, the headline, and it's not just us, other groups like the FEP study coming out of AFP and others have reported they're seeing really good positive results in terms of fundraising and certainly online. And we were able to see the same. So we saw that giving overall is up by 2%. Online is up by 20%. So online is really naturally where you would think in a pandemic that you would see these astronomical, sort of increases. It of course is not evenly balanced, right? I mean, we're sitting here with environmental organizations. And so if you think about the landscape in terms of where that increase was happening, it certainly wasn't even across the board. So we see huge spikes in giving to human services organizations, as you might expect, that encompass food banks in the middle of a pandemic. You're seeing spikes in advocacy organizations, certainly ones that have been a part of the movement around equity that we we're all talking about mid-year last year and continue to today. So I think what is important for this group, and so just to give you the snapshot, so environmental organizations, if you look at year over year, we're actually down 7% year over year compared to 2019. But when you zoom out a little bit, which I think is probably the more important thing to think about, when you zoom out and you look at the 3-year trend, for the last 3 years, environmental organizations are still up over a percentage point in terms of giving. And what that tells you, and it's a similar story that we're seeing in arts and cultural organizations, what that shows you too is that for organizations that are not at the front of the headlines, right, the ones that are kind of getting national news attention, they will see perhaps at times like this, we've seen this in other years, like in 2017, when there was a lot of big headlines and a lot of political activity going on. We saw groups like Planned Parenthood and ACLU see a big spike because they were in the headlines, right? But for organizations that aren't in the headlines, we don't see the same, commensurate spike. But when you zoom out into the 3-year view, which is what we do, or even way further, like Giving USA that takes a 40-year look in terms of the overall giving trends over time, what you see is you actually start to see a trend of real consistency, right? That the loyal donors continue to be loyal. We have a really hard time with retention of new donors. Every type of organization across the board has a really hard time with retention of new donors. So I think that when you start to look at the longer term trends, it's actually a positive story. The important thing to ask, especially if you're in an organization like an environmental organization who doesn't get the benefit of being in the national news, is that it's about how do you build really resilient fundraising programs? How do you incorporate practices that are not just, flash in the pan kind of, interesting ideas, but what are the things that we want to lean into? I'm really excited about this panel because that's really the focus of this panel, right? Is we want to sit and pause on what is this disruption of the last year? What does it mean for the longer term trends? Are there things that will inevitably disrupt the sector going forward? And how do we use this moment and try to at least lean into a little bit of the silver linings to help us navigate this in the most effective way. So that's really our objective today in bringing this panel together, was to have that discussion. So feel free later on to ask specific questions about those trends as well. But that's just a little taste of what we're seeing. And as it comes up, I may inject a couple another little few more points of trends that we're seeing too, if it's relevant to the conversation. But with that, I would love to introduce our panel today that we're going to be diving into this with. So we've got Adrienne Longenecker with us today, who is the executive director at the Colorado River Alliance. Adrienne and I actually go back almost 10 years now through our both mutual roles on the AFP board. But Adrienne is executive director now, but actually has a really long career in fundraising and has moved up through various roles. She also, has done not only fundraising, but she served as the COO of the Hill Country Conservancy prior to that. She's got numerous board positions. Currently, she serves on the actual international board of the Association of Fundraising Professionals, AFP, and on the Austin Outside board of directors. She's also a CFRE. You guys have heard of that. So it means that she's well esteemed and way credentialed to be in our presence. And I'm really excited to have her representing a small organization of only a few full-time employees. So even as executive director, she really has her hands in not just strategy, but also in all aspects of the organization and building and developing relationships. Our next panelist is Margot Piper. Margot, say hello. And she comes to us through TreeFolks, which they have planted nearly 3 million trees in Central Texas to help promote clean water and air. And what is most important is also to provide shade in this crazy Central Texas heat, right? But Margot is really interesting and coming to us from a medium-sized organization where they have 7 full-time employees. She she came in as development or major gift officer and as development director. But she also, so not only is she really steeped in this engagement and how do we engage stakeholders and supporters, but she also came from the for-profit side and has done heavy communications work. So she worked with Cars to Go North America and Enviromedia, which was an agency, a marketing and advertising agency. So it was really cool to hear the way that she's bringing that into her work now at the organization. And then finally, last but not least, is Michelle Vryn, who comes from the Bat Conservation International. Which, as you guys know, being in Austin, they work to conserve the world's bats and their ecosystems. We'll get into more about what that means in that organization this year in just a minute, but she is the director of institutional giving and also a medium-sized organization, but they have 35 full-time employees. And I keep saying that because I think it's really important to understand our roles and what that means in terms of bandwidth. But Michelle, in that role, if you think about institutional giving, she actually is overseeing the funding from governments and foundations and the corporate funding community. In that role, she also has come from the development team. She worked with the Nature Center in Houston prior to coming there. She's also a CFRE and serves on the AFP Austin chapter board as the VP of Communications, which actually is a role that I served years ago, and I didn't even realize that she was in that role now. I actually have rolled off. I realized when Francoise gave me that bio that I have an old bio out there somewhere. I don't know where it is, but I've rolled off that board as of a couple of years ago. but I do know, these amazing women also through my experience there. So I couldn't be more thrilled to welcome and introduce the three of them to our panel discussion today. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you, Ashley.
So as I was sharing a little bit, I wanted to just level set. Part of why I wanted to give our audience here a little bit of a landscape on the size of organizations that each of us are coming from is I think it's important context to this conversation, because where I wanted to actually start is I wanted to ask each of you to share out a little bit about what these impacts have been to your organization in 2020. What were the biggest things? What were the biggest disruptions? And not necessarily in terms of solutions yet and what you did, but what were the biggest things that highlighted a gap for you and the biggest disruption to your workforce strategy? So I'll kick it off with you, Adrienne. I wonder if you can share a little bit about what that experience has been as you are witnessing as you come into this in 2021.
Well, thanks, Ashley. I'm happy to respond first. And let me say thanks again, Francoise, for all of your work and for pulling together this group and everything you did to help us prepare. And yeah, it's still, I get a little tingly when people talk about me. So thank you again, Ashley, for that lovely introduction. You may have seen me blush. And what I like to say this joke that, yeah, Ashley and I have known each other for 10 years or so. I'm really only like 29. I just look like I'm 50 because I've been a professional fundraiser for so many years. And many of those years I've had the pleasure of knowing Ashley. So what a unique time to be having this conversation. I think it's fun that we're all women on the panel, and we just recently got to celebrate International Women's Day. I also think it's very fascinating that here we are, many of us experiencing exactly what was happening a year ago, just as things were starting to get shut down, just as events were being canceled, just as the big question of, oh my gosh, what happens next, really started to become very apparent, that it was a question we were going to have to answer. So at this time, a year ago, with Hill Country Conservancy, and I see my good friend Fleetwood from Hill Country Conservancy on the call with us today, but certainly some of the first things that were completely disrupted were where are we going to work? How are we going to work? And then for us at the time, the big question about our event, which is an in-person event that typically happens in the fall. So that truly for us illustrated that we had never even considered a plan B for our in-person event. COVID also highlighted how much of our donor stewardship and donor engagement is place-based. Like many of us that work in the environmental group, it's a place-based organization. And when that place can no longer be accessed safely, that definitely highlighted some gaps about how do we steward our donors. And then the last thing I'll say about the big aha and what it illustrated for us at the time was that cash is king, and that fundraising so often is both about the short term and the long term. It's about the pledges. It's about the long-term relationship. But all of a sudden, due to COVID, it was very crystal clear that cash is king. How much cash do we have on hand, and how long is that going to allow us to continue to work?
Thanks, Adrienne. Michelle, can you share a little bit on your experience?
Yeah, of course. I definitely second everything Adrienne said, but we'll add on top of that, of course, working at Bat Conservation International, the pandemic and novel coronavirus hit us in a very different way as the fact that we work with bats. And I think that even though we were unique in the stance of we had to really think about crisis communication and making sure that internally that we were communicating the science that was known and also the science that was unknown, which is like always the case, right? Like we needed to make sure we were on the same page internally before we went out externally and started sharing messages broadly. I mean, I will say, with this team, like we're all friends here, like that took longer than I would have liked. Like I think to all get on the same page, and we definitely had varying feelings of like how fast we should turn around messaging and because as I'm sure you guys remember following a lot of the science here, there's things we still don't know about the novel coronavirus, and there's things that we do know. Like we still don't know how it spilled over from animal to human. We do know coronavirus now is being transmitted from human to human. And so I think having to think through very difficult science concepts and making sure like the layperson, including myself, like was able to understand those things was something that took, definitely a little bit of time. And we did bring in some outside like consultation firms, communications, PR firms. So that was all like very interesting to work with those external parties. But so I think one, like, just having the crisis communication plan in place is always a good thing. Maybe you don't know exactly what those details would be like when it's fulfilled, but just kind of having a route of, step 1, 2, 3, 4 to get to the messaging we need to get, like that would be something that we have in place now, but we didn't have in place before. And I think second, it just really iterates to me that all of our, even though all of us here, like we have our, 15, 10-word mission statement, so much of our work in environmental conservation, it's all connected. And I think that with the pandemic, it's really highlighted how connected of a global community we are. And I definitely expect that trend to continue as we all really push towards more climate change measures like during this decade. So those are the top things that come to mind.
Thanks, Michelle. And that's a good example of perhaps being in a headline, but perhaps on the wrong side of the headline. Not the side you want to be on in responding to. Margot, same question for you.
Oh, yeah. Truly echoing a lot of what Adrienne and Michelle said. Additionally, just hearing about looking at that cash on hand got my heart racing, because that was the first thing we did was, how long can we operate with what we have? And yeah, I mean, I forgot we did that. So now my heart's like, oh yeah, you remember those feelings. But, it was the best worst case scenario for TreeFolks in terms of timing when COVID happened, because the tree planting season in Texas is usually October through March. So we do all of our programming in that chunk of months in the midst of all the holidays and the madness that you can imagine. And we schedule that out, we're planning now for next year's, even though we're still finishing up this year's season. So we fortunately had, we were postponing every in-person event, of course, and thinking like, okay, in a few months we could pick that back up. Hello, galas, forget about it. But, we were looking at all these areas and thinking, okay, so as long as we get all the trees out, we can honor all of our contracts and commitments, still file the reports, the grant funding can come through, sort of hedging our bets of like, just get those trees out the door, get those trees in the ground. So that was like the number one pivot for us, is evaluating where are we on our timeline and how will that change. And so thankfully, it was just a few weeks that we really had to push. And I'm calling all of our partners saying, okay, here's the situation, here's what we promised you. And so it was a lot of communication. On top of that, a large portion of us were still working with desktop computers. So that was a huge aha moment, because our office looked like zombie apocalypse if you went in there a few weeks after COVID, because everybody's desks were cleared off and everybody lunked these huge things home. And I personally went through like 8 laptops that I dusted off from the closets of TreeFolks, you know, like, does this one work? Okay, no, does this one work? And so that was another huge evaluation point of like, let's get ourselves up to the current century, which was another fundraising task, but it was like evaluating the tools that we needed, the tools that we had accessible, and like opportunities along the way. So yeah, just to add on to everybody else.
So not just disruption to what happened in 2020, but just really coming into the modern age disruption. So I think this is a good opportunity to actually hear from some of you. And when you entered, there was a poll that we asked each of you to take. So I would love to see if we could throw up some of those responses to see what some of you are reporting. So. So it looks like a good percentage of you are smaller, right? Have 1 to 3 or 4 to 10 full-time employees, which would make sense for a local organization in this space. And then what types of fundraising do you currently pursue? Heavily reliant on grants and corporate partnerships. We certainly saw some of those questions come through in your questions for the panelists. And then events, major gifts, direct mail, of course. And then your organization's funding has seen some downturn, with a third of you saying that you're doing better than before. So that's fantastic. I look forward to hearing some of your commentary in our breakout session that we will move into after this discussion. So on that thread, then I feel like it's important to understand, you know, too, when we think about those changes that you guys just shared. I mean, it sounds like it really was, you know, a collective forced pause of taking stock of what are the biggest and most pressing needs to keep the organization just moving, right? How do we just keep actually working in this new environment? But then also having to navigate around disruptions to your business and fundraising as usual, right? When there were events, I know we've seen that across the board for every type of organization in terms of events in the spring. I think it was really interesting, Margot, and hearing just the timing of things and thinking about, you know, what can we prepare for now based on what we know versus what will inevitably come up later. So I would love to know, in thinking about our constituents, right, at the heart of the work that we do. So aside from your internal staff, those stakeholders, what about your external stakeholders and those that have been really on this journey with you from that standpoint? I would love to know how, and I would start this with perhaps with Margot here. When you took stock of what happened and you thought about providing that level of continuous communication, what were the things that you did? What changed about your approach this year that you could not, you know, just be business as usual this year when you tackled that?
That's a great question. You know, we first of all went through every protocol that we have, and I itemized areas that weren't going to work anymore because we're so heavily dependent on being in the office or being in person. So sort of just seeing where the pitfalls were, understanding like where the pivot needed to happen. So that was absolutely the first thing that we did. And a lot of that, we were getting so excited because we had finally created this corporate menu of options that perfectly aligned. This is going to speak to some of your hearts. Perfectly aligned what our programs did and where the money needed to come from and what we could offer to a corporate partner. And it was like my dream child. And we were just getting ready to launch this thing that was going to make all my dreams come true. That's what I get for putting all those eggs in a basket. So essentially, you know, put that out the window and understanding, redialing into each of those personal relationships. So not just the broad scatter plot of like, hey, this is what TreeFolks is doing this year, but really having more meaningful conversations with those corporate partners saying, you know, we all understand this is going to be some weird times, right? So what can we do that would be most meaningful to continue this partnership with you guys, given these parameters? And a lot of it was truly just having those conversations. So one of our corporate partners started this like concert series, and they have 3 different nonprofits that they cycle through and donate $1,000 every other week to those nonprofits. And because we had that conversation early with them, TreeFolks got to be one of those 3. And so Factors won tonight, you know, and it's just like things like that where I never would have gone to them and said, can you host like private concerts and like give us money? You know, of course I wasn't going to say that, but just opening that door in that discussion area of like, you guys understand our needs and how critical it is that we like can continue forward through this hard time. But we also want to understand your needs and your mission and how can we align with that. So from a corporate standpoint, yeah, I think we did that right. And a lot of them are like, hey, hang with us. We're there in solidarity. We can't give you money this year. But you know, just being an emotional partner was just as important in the long run. Because now we're starting to build things for this upcoming year, and they're even better than we ever could have imagined. So it's been thumbs up.
Yeah, that's great. I think it's from what I keep hearing is the organizations that were really proactive with corporate sponsors, but also with funders, just to explain here's how they're thinking about it and how they tackle it. So I wonder then, you know, in thinking about Michelle within your instance where you also had to pause and figure out what you were going to say, and what you could say in an informed way that can help bring stakeholders along. So I would love to know for you is what did that pivot look like, and not just with corporate sponsors, but board members and major donors. What did that look like in terms of, you know, did you have a slow roll of information? How patient were they? What was your experience with those stakeholders?
Yeah, it was interesting, similar to what Margot was saying. A lot of the conversations I had specifically with foundations who are current supporters of us. And so we were like, you know, we're on a cycle with them. Like we had to say that, you know, a lot of our scientific and field staff can't go out in the field. Like there was the shortage of PPE, which is your personal protective equipment. And we, of course, opted like to not be using PPE because there was like a national shortage. So we couldn't be going out in the field. There was work to be done though. So I think like that was our pivot message of really letting the foundations know, like we have so much data to process. We have like GIS work where we need to do data analysis, partner planning. Because remember, we have partners around the globe who are also kind of just stuck at home. Like we have like, you know, regional plans we need to be making, and we need to be working on specific scientific publications. So there's work to be done. Are you okay with, like, we wrote this grant with this scope of work, but this is what we need to do now. How do you feel about that, foundation? And, you know, like Margot was saying, I mean, I think that everyone was very understanding, very supportive, you know, wanted us to continue doing work that needed to be done, even if it wasn't in the scope of what they originally were interested in, which, I mean, it was really refreshing. And I think it kind of makes me wonder, at least, like, why we maybe didn't have like such open conversations in the past. And a lot of our work that was in person, as many of you may know, we have Bracken Cave Preserve, which is a tract of land that we own and manage. And we have like bat flights every bat season. And this was during the height of that. And so we pivoted from doing in-person bat flights for members and close supporters to a lot of virtual engagement. And, you know, all of that was new. Like we didn't know like what was going to work, what wasn't going to work. But overall, I mean, I think the foundations specifically were very accommodating and understanding. And I mean, I think it was just a really refreshing conversation to have.
That's wonderful. And what an opportunity I think that it created too with the national dialogue about how funders of all types are actually partners to help organizations through. So Adrienne, when we were chatting before this session, we were talking about this idea of stakeholders and, you know, sort of taking it back a step and thinking about just environmental causes in general. You know, as I was sort of alluding to before when we were talking about, you know, when you're not in front of the headlines, you know, those are the folks that get, albeit probably a lot of the new donors that come in that flood the system. What is your take on that, especially just, you know, as someone who has experience in different types of environmental organizations? around those stakeholders and their commitment, and what are the kind of keys to communication that keep them retained through that long haul for you?
Well, such a great question. And again, I'll just give a lot of props to some of the women that are on the call today. Fleetwood, who worked with me at HCC, and I see Carrie has joined, who currently works with me at Colorado River Alliance. And I mean, just like we've retained friends over a long period of time, donor retention, engaging with our stakeholders is just about picking up the phone, calling, and checking on one another. And that was one of the first things we did at Hill Country Conservancy to solve the issue of no longer having a place-based donor stewardship program. We picked up the phone and called. I think it was Fleetwood who pulled the list and created the donor call list. And we called donors of all types, all levels, just to ask, how are you doing? And certainly, as you made the point, Ashley, like at points, environmentalism, specifically climate resiliency, sort of peaked into the headlines. You may recall early in the pandemic when barely anyone was on a plane or in a car, we were hearing about that impact to both air quality as well as to species that were coming out into places that they hadn't been in some time. And so it did give us a thread into that moment in time to connect with our donors. But ultimately, we just connected with our donors to ask, how are you doing? And that was our guiding light, was to remain relevant and kind. And that spoke to both how we were with each other as coworkers, but then also how we were with our individual donors of all sizes, because every gift matters. In fact, I'm just going to a link to the Fundraising Effectiveness Project that Ashley mentioned earlier, a project of AFP, which highlights the ongoing importance of donor retention. So yeah, just like we do with our friends, we called, we picked up the phone. As you mentioned, Ashley, we dialed in with our key stakeholders to ask, how are you doing? Is there anything we can do for you? And what we learned is helping people stay connected to one another and connected to our beautiful natural environment was really, really important. And then that helped drive another solution for us, which was a social media campaign to just provide as many pictures of the beauty of nature as possible. So I think I answered your question about how we connected with our donors.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, I think that you bring up a really important point, which is relationships are relationships, right? Whether you are on a Zoom call or sending a direct mail or talking on the phone or meeting at an actual event face-to-face, relationships are there, right? And the way that we show kindness and care for the people that care about us is really what is and creates a long-term meaningful relationship. So that, sort of leads me to, we know that, and I think you said something really great before about like donors who care, right? So it's like, it's the idea of making sure that we can still stay relevant in the channels in which the people that have been supporting us for a long time are active in. But there's also been this disruption, right, to communication systems in just, all, right? I know in our charitable giving report, we found that the big headline was that 13% of all giving now was coming online, which what doesn't sound that astronomical, but we've always been 3 or 4 points behind the consumer market generally, because when you factor in major gifts, most major gifts still come offline. So this was the first time that we actually really mirrored and are within a percentage point of what was happening in the consumer market. So it's really interesting to think about what this disruption will mean long-term in the way that we've now built in a comfort level with donors that perhaps didn't exist before. So I'd like to dive into that a little bit and to also not just digital engagement, but events, right? If we look at, as we go into 2021, We all thought that the silver bullet was going to be the turning of the calendar year in January 1st, but I mean, we're all in Texas. We all can see, I mean, as evidenced by a couple of weeks ago, that we should be maybe talking about the crazy 18 months at this point, not just the last, not just 2020, right? It's still going. We still have a bit of a stretch here. So would love to hear from you from the panel on how you're thinking about engagement going forward, whether that's through event or through social media, like Adrienne mentioned. And so, Margot, I wonder if you could, certainly, share a little bit about how you now are thinking about specifically around engagement and within what channels.
That's a great question. And it's something that I think about daily, probably too much, actually. But, all of us are missing that human connection. And even yesterday I did curbside pickup at the library, and then I end up having like a 20-minute conversation with the librarian, like through a car. And like, that's how hungry we were to talk to a human face to face from 20 feet apart. But it's something that we think about a lot because trees in and of themselves like have to be planted in the ground in person. And so we routed ourselves from being almost 100% volunteer based to getting, hundreds of thousands of trees in the ground, to like hiring the Texas Conservation Corps to come in and do that. And that has dropped. I mean, that was our engagement point with most of the community was, curbside pickups for your free 5-gallon tree, or come plant thousands and thousands of trees with us on a Saturday morning, and you'll blow your own mind because you'll plant more trees than you can count, And so we've gone strictly to digital at this point, and it hurts for so many of us that are just hungry for that connection. So in terms of events in the future and having that engagement beyond the digital side, we have little pockets of digital communications with our young professionals group, and they're holding trivia events, which are open to the public, and things like that. But it's not necessarily for fundraising, but it's still keeping that engagement and that connection. But now we're looking at events where, okay, can we get a partner, who has a lot of land? And then can we also have a partner who can come in and sponsor all of the picnic materials, and everybody can take those home, so we're not generating a lot of trash. And so we're just trying to find opportunities that still feel personally and emotionally engaging, while still standing a little bit out from the crowd. And yeah, the virtual gala, it just hasn't appealed to us in a way that we're just sort of like blinders, because we're like, okay, we can't do it. We'll do it if we have to. But yeah, it has been quite a struggle. And yeah, like I said, I just get books from the library now just to have conversations with those librarians. They're like, are you even reading Tolstoy? I'm like, no, I just want to talk to you. So anyway, yeah, we're always looking for options and opportunities.
Well, and a good example of where, when we do start to reopen, there will be an automatic hunger to reconnect. People are just waiting in the wings, I think. Michelle, what about you? I mean, with your organization, how have you pivoted in terms of engagement?
Yeah, I mean, to me, I think the biggest / most impactful pivot would be our virtual engagement, specifically geared towards stewardship of major donors. So we've never really done a lot of special events, so I can't speak to that too much. But on our stewardship level, of course, now, as everyone should always be thinking, but we're thinking even more of this in the pandemic, the stewardship of your current donors is paramount. And one thing that we've implemented is the idea of kind of doing more informal, I don't want to say they're not webinars, because I know we're all webinared out, but I think of them more as like fireside chats, like informal conversations with groups of major donors. And so a lot of our donors tend to fall, like maybe they're, part of the same family, or they know each other like through some other network connection. So we can like group them together and have updates with like our program staff. And so the idea is, you get behind the scenes of like, here's like our favorite pictures from our work in Fiji, or here's like, things you would never think about, like being a bat scientist in the field that you have to deal with, just like a really behind the scenes look at some of our work, but tailoring these conversations in a very informal way where it spotlights our program staff, who are, I mean, we're lucky because we have complete rock stars in our science and conservation team. I mean, they're like the most fascinating people who, like, we have a section of our conservation team. I mean, pre-COVID, they would spend like 70% of their time like underground in mines and caves. I mean, they're fascinating people, like even just like the gear they use and the training they go through. I mean, those kind of insider details are just like really sexy to anyone, especially like major donors who are helping support this work. And I think that's been a good change of mind of like stewardship, is having these informal conversations on Zoom, but where you can ask questions and you can see their personalities, and it's a little scripted with a couple of prompt questions, but besides that, it's not overly scripted. So I think that's been a very healthy idea that has popped up from this.
Yeah, I love that. I'm going to steal that idea of these fireside chats. I think that that's a lovely example of where, people are still seeking connection. We do a lot of talking when we look at these broader trends about how the fundamentals are still the fundamentals, and they're always going to be the fundamentals, right? Human beings naturally crave and seek certain connection and certain connective tissue. So the idea that, we're a virtual event is unable to put together folks in the physical space, right? Like they used to be able to. How do we try to create some semblance of that in the virtual world? So I love that idea of fireside, more intimate chats like the fireside chat, and being able to do that. So for Adrienne, for you, in thinking about, as an organization, I know that you also are sort of heavily reliant on volunteers. What does that look like for you, and what has the pivot been? And also sort of additionally, I would love to sort of think about what are the digital aspects that you think that will continue to stay in that as far as channels going forward?
Well, here I'm going to talk a little bit about Colorado River Alliance, which is a youth education and outreach organization that I had the pleasure of joining in January. And a majority of the programs for CRA prior to the pandemic were field trips to the Redbud Center, the Ray Wilkerson Center on Lake Austin Boulevard. So the organization very quickly pivoted and provided digital curriculum and digital field trips. And I've had the opportunity to attend several of these digital field trips now. And I do believe that they will continue even after we're able to do in-person field trips at Redbud. As you can imagine, many students and teachers are used to this digital interface. And in fact, we're finding our educator partners were really ready for somebody else to step in and take over the Zoom lesson. And that for the kids, it wasn't too much of a pivot because they're used to interfacing with an educator digitally now. And they're typically a multi-part series, which is really fantastic because it's provided just a little bit of information, but over several weeks and going back to the same students. Additionally, through the digital field trips, we're able to connect with an entire grade of an entire school, whereas sometimes the capacity of in-person programming didn't allow for every single fifth grader from Bluebonnet Elementary to come on the same day at the same time. So I do believe those will continue, and it's really been a fantastic pivot that both had a great impact as far as education with the students, but also helping out our educator partners and just giving them a little breath to step back and let someone else interface with the students. Additionally, Colorado River Alliance each year with Lake Travis, with the county, Travis County does a Lake Travis cleanup. In the fall, it was very different, as you can imagine, due to the pandemic. But the organization learned how to effectively and safely do a volunteer cleanup during a pandemic. So on April 24th, we'll be doing our spring clean. We're looking at downstream creeks and parks of Travis County, and we already have many of the protocols in place to assure that the appropriate PPE is worn. And the other aspect of engagement that I believe will continue is incorporating more digital moderation of volunteers ahead of time. So helping to provide as much information ahead of time digitally so that when people arrive day of, we don't have to gather as a group to go over instructions. That information's already been shared digitally, so it allows for the space that we all want in order to feel comfortable And then lastly, I would say that, again, my good friend Carrie that's on this call right now from Colorado River Alliance, we serve all 40,000 square miles of the river basin. And so this has given us a renewed opportunity to be less Austin-centric and to look at areas where the recent governor's action to release the mask mandate is very warmly received. Which is allowing for us to do a little bit more in-person programming, including some education, some happy hours that we're planning for late May and June, because those communities are already comfortable with gathering in person. So those are the three things: the digital curriculum, digital field trips. I'm sure we're going to continue those because they've been wildly successful. We're going to continue with in-person cleanups here in the Austin area that help everybody feel safe because of everything we learned in the fall when we did the creek cleanup. And then additionally, continuing to connect outside of Austin where perhaps just the approach to the pandemic is different than you would find in Austin.
Yeah, that's great. And I love this concept of, what is now possibly going to be hybrid going forward, right? A hybrid strategy going forward. For a long time as a sector, we've been grappling with this idea of how do we reach and engage younger generations? How do we bring more diverse, groups of supporters into the mix? And so having kind of all channels and all tactics in our arsenal, which, perhaps we've been overly reliant on a couple for a long time. My hope is that it really does provide an opportunity to pivot, right? And to pivot as it makes sense. And so taking things like having to really focus on what that virtual experience is like, and even, identify, who are the virtual leaders and giving folks roles. I mean, other groups have done such a great job of that, of, having, sustained giving, sort of captains in different regional areas. And I've had such good success with it that it's a beautiful thing to think about. How do we actually translate that into a virtual environment, and even perhaps expand our reach, right? Because virtual has no borders. We're not geographically sort of limited like we might have been before. So I love this concept, and it's such good sort of food for thought in taking some of these traditional and typical things that we've been doing and just thinking about what's the outside the box thinking that we do to pivot in order to be successful in now a new hybrid and broadened sense of how those things are delivered. And hopefully along the way also sort of provide opportunity for additional sort of equitable sort of access to those events and programs. So that leads me, actually, we are about to break out and talk a little bit more deeply about some of these different subjects. So we're going to automatically put you into your different breakout groups. But just to give you the sense, Adrienne's going to be talking about leadership and how organizations can disrupt can embrace this disruption for the better. Margot is going to be talking about this intersection between development and communications, which is so important right now. Michelle is going to be looking at community-centered fundraising, which, as I just was talking about, is how do we make this a more equitable space for all stakeholders to come on board. And then Francoise is going to be really talking about corporate engagement and leading a panel on that. So once we come back, for the benefit of all, so we don't have to all be in each breakout, then each of our panel leaders here are going to be actually doing a couple minutes share out of what was discussed in each one of those breakouts. And then time permitting, we'll open it up for some questions at the end. So Francoise or Haven, I don't know if you have any additional information for the folks on the call, but if not, I think we have about 20 minutes to be able to engage in those conversations.
Yeah, that's right. So we have 20 minutes to chat, and encourage you guys certainly to be discussing as well, not just the panelists discussing. This is meant to be a full discussion. And I think, I guess we're being pulled in, guys. You should be going into your rooms now.
Everybody, welcome back. So you trickle back in. I see, it looks like our panelists have made it back in. I know that I was sitting in Margot's room and we were having such a good discussion. I felt like probably could have sat and talked for another 15 minutes, 30 minutes or more, just to hear. I had so many follow-up questions that I wanted to ask, and it wasn't my breakout to lead. So, but it's so good. So Margot, I'll start with you. Just can you share out, a couple minutes on what were the big themes and the takeaways from our breakout session where we were talking about the intersection between development and communications in the last year?
Absolutely. And I agree. Yeah. I mean, this meeting, I hope it's not our last, because it's just so nice to have just we're all coming from the same sort of situation and hearing like how hard we're all working and like, okay, I'm doing that too. Or, it's really nice to have this conversation amongst all the development that we're doing as well. So thank you, Ashley. And thanks for being a part of our team. I know you had questions too. And I'm like, would Ashley ask this? But we're talking about development and communications, obviously hand in hand. And for me, that's my specialty. But honestly, we've had a lot of really good takeaways. So a lot of us had a lot of large events that we had to cancel and we'd been working on for a long amount of time. And what I really liked was that even though they weren't necessarily the same impact that we were planning that they would be, they sort of were allowed to be extended digitally in ways that we never would have been able to have in person. One of the takeaways was that truly we could show behind the scene work that's happening, that you couldn't do at an in-person gala. You can't bring a large bird of prey into like the Hilton ballroom, or maybe you can. I'm going to ask next time. But also having a really quick reaction to opportunities that are presented to you was another pivot that, it aligned the communications and development of having opportunities to get awareness from larger corporations or organizations with a larger reach, and just seeing the opportunities and pivoting that way and being part of the bigger story is another way that our group talked about the changes that happened this past year. Another awesome idea, was this, like we talked about, ask an expert, ask an ecologist, having these fireside chats, or like that we call them the Twitter chat questionnaire Q&A story times that really took off and sort of spiraled, or even became something that will continue even when we're able to do things in person, because now you have this larger interaction with a team of people that you never spoke to before. And then, we talked about expanding your reach. So, all of us have our core followers that, I always know that, Sarah's going to share this post. So how do we get beyond that, that sphere of group of people that just like is agreeing with us? So we talked about advocacy posts where people are having conversations, and the more comments that are occurring, the algorithms on Facebook really amplify those. And all of a sudden we're getting eyes on posts of social media that are so dire right now. We need that attention that we never would have had before, because people are commenting about, how they feel. And this is a time when we can really leverage, I'm not talking about internet trolls, but I'm talking about everybody has a voice and it's important to hear it. And this is a time when people want to be heard and to share, their beliefs. So why not lean into it?
Yeah, rage giving is a real thing, people. So on sort of on a related topic, I know Michelle was trying to think about that sort of concept of getting beyond our current list, and how do we provide a more community-centered experience to engage folks. So do you want to share a little bit about that topic and what the discussion provided?
Sure. Yeah, I would love to. I mean, I think that I'll start off by echoing something Margot said. Like, we all just felt very comforted knowing that we were in a room where everyone had like similar experiences, and just knowing that you have that camaraderie of going through this past year, we felt was very therapeutic. So I'm grateful for this opportunity and hope that we have more in the future. But specifically about your constituent engagement, yeah, I mean, I think we all agreed that before the pandemic, we would spend so much time on things like our e-newsletter, who, that's our core group of followers. They know us, like they're familiar with what we do. And during the pandemic, we really had to pivot more to social media channels, but also content that's maybe not for someone who knows who you are and what you do. So kind of creating content around drawing people in was a big theme. And we have some really great examples of like, doing like live paddles like on a river. Like there was one like 75-mile trip that was like live streamed paddling down a river. And those kind of things, like they've always been engaging. And I think that a theme for our group was we've just, I know we all know this, guys, like as nonprofits, we're just so busy and we oftentimes don't have the time to really pursue like these big, bold ideas. And a lot of that is social media related. I mean, there is somewhat of a learning curve, right? Like you have to figure out how to do your Facebook fundraiser, but this gave us the time to figure out how to do that. And also, I think in some ways, we were more willing to take the risk. And I know in our group, like there were things that were tried that were really successful. Like there was one anecdote of this live stream probably brought in like 30% more member engagement than previously was experienced. I mean, that's like amazing from one event. But some things didn't work. And I think now we are owning the attitude of like, and that's okay. Like we tried something, didn't work. Now we know like it's not a failure. We learned from it. Like, let's move on. And so I think that's a really healthy mentality to take on that I think we all will continue to have moving forward. But also too, in social media, there is just that ability to reach a more diversified audience. And also we had a good conversation around seeing our other environmental peers on social media and seeing everyone else kind of like step up their social media game. So we felt like, oh crap, like we gotta step up our game too, because everybody else is doing some creative stuff. So I think like in a lot of ways, our constituent diversification happened on social media. We're more willing to take risks, tried some stuff didn't work. And we foresee that definitely that kind of mentality going and sticking with us in the future.
Yeah, I love that. I love that, your peers help raise the bar for everyone in terms of expectations. And I think that that came out in Margot's breakout too, where we were talking about, having to tell the story. It becomes really important, right? Especially if you think that you have new donors that are coming in or experiencing something for the first time. And Eric shared about, being able to tell that story and show the work that, you wouldn't have been able to do, in the ballroom before. So I wonder if, Francoise, you can share a little bit about, speaking about, being more equitable. I felt like this year, corporations and foundations really sort of stepped up to the plate and took more risk in how they really responded to some of the current events that were happening. So what was your conversation like about corporate engagement, and how are organizations thinking about that and what was working for them?
Yeah, so unsurprisingly, we kind of walked through some of the challenges we're seeing in corporate engagement and then how we're addressing those challenges in particular, and shared some ideas around that. And unsurprisingly, the main challenge was just simply, how do we pivot from what we've always done? What are some of the new strategies? What are the ways that we can be engaging these folks? And, some of that, kind of hitting what we were talking about earlier, where it used to be you could have that personal connection, that one-on-one coffee or meeting somewhere at the office. And now you're seeing that more virtually, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just maybe the way that these companies are even thinking about how they're engaging their nonprofit partners might be changing too. So someone was giving an example of them receiving additional companies, reaching out to them, sort of these companies who have sort of like a subscription service where they're working with corporations on employee engagement activities, and then reaching out to nonprofits to sort of fulfill some of those employee engagement activities, sort of like as a catalog or a menu. So you're even seeing as corporations are looking for ways to engage their employees and make sure that they're set and that they're connected to them virtually, that is such a significant pool that it seems that there are companies that are developing themselves to address that need as well. So that might be a way that, nonprofits can be reaching out with some of these virtual activities, some of these virtual engagement is, hey, like we know that you're trying to connect to your community, you're still trying to connect to your employees. What are some virtual ways that we can be working there as well? And then there are some other examples, some really fun ideas. Lauren from Big Bend Conservancy was talking about a documentary that they showed talking about the, the Big Bend Park and how they actually created a Zoom conversation with the directors afterwards, that they were not expecting a lot of folks to attend or to be fully engaged, but it really was a really robust conversation. Folks dialed on. It was, donors that she was not expecting who would normally be engaged digitally, but they were really there and present. And how, that she's been receiving calls all day about folks being like, how do we have more content like that? And it kind of hits on, I think, a theme that's already been expressed so many times here, which is, yes, things have changed because we're all virtual, but virtual also means that you can connect with groups that maybe you hadn't in the past. Maybe some of your events and your activities are actually more accessible, which is, an exciting thing to have. And, for us here at EarthShare of Texas, we even have companies reaching out to us saying, hey, there's, Texas is a growing state. It's a growing state population wise, companies who are coming here. It's a very outdoorsy state. I think we're very proud of sort of the keep Texas beautiful or don't mess with Texas kind of mentality. And so you see a lot more opportunities to maybe even partner with some of those companies in their localization strategies as they're trying to reach Texas customers as well. So it was certainly a robust conversation, a lot of fun. I think there are some connections made that hopefully will continue outside of this conversation too. But yeah, it was really fascinating.
Yeah. Just from just those last few, sort of share outs, what an interesting landscape to try to navigate right now, right? So I would love to hear, in our last couple of minutes from Adrienne, just about from your discussion on leadership and how can organizations really embrace this disruption and navigating that to the future. I mean, maybe need a whole other hour to talk about that piece, but I wonder if you can share a little bit.
Well, we had a fantastic group that represented all levels of organization. So whether that was a board member or a fundraiser who reports directly to the CEO, or a fundraiser that reports to a DD that reports to the CEO. So our question about leadership first centered on, as fundraisers, sometimes we don't feel like leaders of the organization. Sometimes we feel like a fulfillment center. So the first thing leaders can do to continue to embrace disruption is all hands on deck. Pull everybody together. Let everybody know that they are a leader, and illustrate how each individual employee's work does tie to the greater mission of the organization. So get all hands on deck, connect with everybody to both understand how they're feeling about the disruption, whether it's the lack of clean water and electricity because of a storm, or it's the brutal murder of a Black man by police, or it's a global pandemic. Like, really check in with everybody and see how they're feeling, because then that will help inform how your constituents are feeling. Additionally, we talked about, like, get out ahead of it, have a plan. Like, we can start to develop scenario plans now for the next big disruption. So embrace that urgent, frenetic need to get out ahead of the disruption, but then also embrace the stillness. Embrace the fact that you can't do everything you were doing, and take a moment of stillness to turn and reflect internally on your organization. And there was an example of how one organization has taken this disruption and the stillness to build up their DEI activities, or their equity, inclusion, diversity, and access. So all hands on deck, make sure everybody feels like they, in fact, are a leader, and that they are empowered to move the organization forward during disruption. Get out in front of it, really lean into the frenetic nature of these disruptions, but then also, like, enjoy the stillness that comes and take it as a moment of reflection. And then lastly, I would just say that what leaders ought to do, and what all of us can do, is breathe. So I invite you all right now to just take a moment. Yeah, put your feet flat on the floor, feel your shoulders, let them drop, take a deep breath in, and let it out. Your work matters. Thank you all for your work. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Adrienne. That was I needed that deep breath, so I appreciate that for sure. So I'd like to give just one more thank you to Ashley, Adrienne, Michelle, Margot, y'all. Thank you so much for spending your time. Y'all, of course, audience members, you guys don't get to see the prep on the back end, but these ladies were so awesome and being collaborative and coordinating this panel. So thank you so much. And thank you all for attending. You know, this session, as I mentioned earlier, is, you know, is thematic with what we're trying to do for our members presently. You know, identifying, again, funds are what are important to you guys. We understand that as far as our relationship, but continuously you guys are coming to us asking, what are some networking opportunities? What are some other learning opportunities that EarthShare of Texas can provide? And this all kind of builds into what we're trying to build as an organization, which is the collective impact that we're trying to foster amongst our members. So other areas that members can be getting involved, as you guys might know, we do have a DEI committee for EarthShare of Texas presently that is for EarthShare of Texas's governance, but also meant as a resource to members as well. It's co-led by Michelle Vryn, one of our lovely panelists, and then also Robin Schneider from Texas Campaign for the Environment. So if that's something that's interesting to you, please reach out to me directly. There are also plenty of other committees that are open to member reps. These are great ways to be participating in EarthShare of Texas and guiding the ways that we are serving you guys as a cooperative. And then also we're open to other ideas on how to support you guys. I'm gonna be sending around a survey after this just to get a sense of how useful was this fundraising session? How was it from a networking perspective? And then what are some other areas that we can be engaging you guys and making sure that you're all set for your various programs and the fundraising that is necessary for those programs. So with that, again, thank you all so much for your time. We will be circulating the recording of this session afterwards as well, once it's been processed, and just looking forward to seeing you guys at the next session.